Somewhere beneath the surface of history, buried under centuries of myth, dismissal, and misunderstanding, there may be a real place behind the most famous lost city in the world, not a fairy tale. Not a fantasy, a real civilization. A real catastrophe. A real disappearance, and the clues have been hiding in plain sight for 2,400 years. The name Atlantis is so loaded with mythology, Hollywood spectacle, and centuries of fantasy that most serious scholars refuse to discuss it at all. Mention it in an academic setting and you risk being dismissed immediately, lumped in with flat-earthers and alien theorists and people who believe ancient astronauts built the pyramids. And yet, the original source of the Atlantis story is not a legend. It is not a folktale passed down through generations, growing more elaborate with each retelling. It is not a religious text or a piece of ancient mythology. It is a philosophical dialogue written by one of the most rigorous, disciplined, and intellectually serious thinkers in the history of Western civilization. His name was Plato. And he did not tell the story of Atlantis as a myth. He told it as history. That distinction matters enormously. Because everything that has come after, every wild theory, every treasure-hunting expedition, every Hollywood blockbuster, has obscured a genuinely fascinating historical question. What was Plato actually describing? Where did the story come from? And is there, somewhere beneath the avalanche of myth that has buried it, a kernel of real historical truth? That is the question this documentary is going to pursue. Not the fantasy Atlantis of popular culture, the sunken supercivilization with crystal energy towers and psychic powers. The real question. The scholarly one. The one that serious archaeologists and historians have quietly wrestled with for decades, because if there is a real event behind Plato's account, even a partial one, even a distorted one, then what happened to the people who experienced it was one of the most catastrophic events in the ancient world. And it left traces. Real, physical, archaeological traces, traces that are still being studied today. To understand the mystery of Atlantis, you have to go back to the original source. Not to Jules Verne. Not to Hollywood. Not to the 19th century occultists who turned Atlantis into a mystical fantasy. You have to go back to a man who was born in Athens around 428 BCE and died around 348 BCE, Plato. Plato was not a storyteller in the popular sense. He was a philosopher, arguably the most influential philosopher in Western history. He was the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. He founded the Academy in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. He wrote on justice, mathematics, cosmology, ethics, politics, and the nature of reality itself. His dialogues, conversations between Socrates and various interlocutors, are among the most carefully constructed intellectual documents of antiquity. Plato was not a man who invented things carelessly. The Atlantis story appears in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, both written around 360 BCE. In Timaeus, a character named Critias, based on Plato's own relative, tells the story as something handed down through his family from a specific historical source, the Athenian statesman Solon, who lived from approximately 638 to 558 BCE. According to Critias, Solon traveled to Egypt, a journey historically attested. Solon did travel and was known to have visited Egypt, and while there, he spoke with priests at the temple city of Sais in the Nile Delta. These priests showed Solon records of ancient history that, they claimed, predated anything in Greek memory. They told him that 9,000 years before their time, that is, approximately 9,600 BCE, there had been a great naval power in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This power had been called Atlantis. It was, the priests said, a confederation of kings ruling a large island, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, according to the text. It was wealthy, powerful, and technologically advanced for its time. Its people had built great cities, harbors, and canals. They had a powerful navy. And at some point, the Atlanteans had attempted a massive military campaign, an attempt to conquer both the Mediterranean world and Egypt. They had been stopped, according to the priest's account, by the Athenians, a detail that has led many scholars to suspect Plato invented or embellished the story for political purposes, to glorify Athens. But let that aside for now. After the failed conquest, catastrophe struck. The priests described earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence. In a single day and night, Athens sank into the sea, and so did Atlantis. The entire island disappeared beneath the Atlantic Ocean, gone forever. That is the original story. And it is surprisingly specific. Plato does not write about Atlantis the way ancient writers wrote about mythology. He does not introduce it with, they say, or, it is told, the standard markers of mythological storytelling in antiquity. He writes about it in very precise terms, specific dates, specific geographic descriptions, specific political structures, specific architectural details. The layout of the capital city of Atlantis is described in elaborate detail: circular canals, a central hill, a palace complex, a temple to Poseidon. It reads less like mythology and more like a somewhat garbled ancient record. And Plato explicitly, repeatedly, insists it is true. In Timaeus, the character Critias introduces the story by saying, the fact that it is not invented fable but genuine history is all important. And later, what I shall now relate is strange but absolutely true. Now, does that prove it? Of course not. Ancient writers often asserted the truth of things that were not true. Plato had philosophical and political motivations for the story. He may have invented it wholesale as an allegory, a thought experiment dressed in historical clothing to make it more compelling. That is the mainstream scholarly view. Atlantis is a philosophical fiction. A cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial ambition and moral corruption. Invented by Plato and placed in a fictional past to give it gravity, it is a perfectly reasonable position, but it is not the only one. And some of the alternative evidence is genuinely difficult to dismiss. If Plato invented Atlantis entirely, he did something strange. He invented it with details that are oddly consistent with what we now know about ancient catastrophes, details he could not have known from any source available to him in the 4th century BCE. Let's examine the specific claims. The date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, 9600 BCE, corresponds roughly to the end of the last ice age. This was a period of genuinely dramatic, catastrophic sea level rise. As the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere melted, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters over several thousand years. Coastlines that had been dry land for millennia disappeared beneath the ocean. Entire landscapes were swallowed by rising seas. We know this now because of modern oceanography, geology, and climate science. Plato had none of these tools. He could not have known that 9600 BCE was a period of extraordinary geographic change. And yet he placed his catastrophe precisely in that era. Coincidence? Possibly. But the coincidence is worth noting. Plato also places Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean. He describes it as a large island. He says it sank. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure fantasy. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic. The ocean floor there is well mapped, and there is no evidence of a recently sunken landmass of any significant size, but the dismissal may have been too hasty. Because Plato says island, not continent. And the Atlantic Ocean does contain islands, the Azores, Madeira, the Canary Islands, that are the tips of volcanic formations rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge. These islands were above water in the past. Parts of them have subsided. None of them, in their known history, sank dramatically in a single day. But they are there, in the right general location, rising from the sea exactly where Plato said there was an island. There is also the question of Plato's numbers. The date of 9600 BCE requires a transmission of memory across approximately 9,200 years from the event to Solon's visit to Egypt. That is a long time for accurate historical memory. Scholars have noted that if you divide Plato's numbers by 10, a common source of error in ancient numerical transmission, where the Greek symbol 400 could be confused with the symbol 410, the timeline shifts dramatically. Instead of 9,000 years before Solon, it becomes 900 years. That would place Atlantis around 1500 to 1400 BCE, and 1500 to 1400 BCE is a very interesting period, because that is when the island of Thera, now called Santorini, exploded. In the southern Aegean Sea, roughly 70 miles north of the island of Crete, there is a cluster of islands that form a broken circle around a deep, flooded volcanic caldera. The largest of these islands is called Thera. Today it is better known by its Venetian name, Santorini. It is one of the most beautiful places on Earth, its white-walled villages clinging to the rim of an ancient catastrophe. That catastrophe occurred sometime around 1620 to 1530 BCE, the exact date is still debated, and the debate is fierce and ongoing among geologists, archaeologists, and historians. But the event itself is not in question. The volcano at Thera erupted. The eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history. It ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, some estimates go higher. The ash cloud reached the stratosphere. The explosion was heard, in all probability, across most of the eastern Mediterranean. The eruption triggered a massive caldera collapse, the central part of the island essentially fell into the sea, creating a tsunami that radiated outward in all directions. The tsunami struck the northern coast of Crete within minutes. Wave heights are estimated to have reached 15 meters or more at some locations. The Minoan civilization, the sophisticated Bronze Age culture centered on Crete that had dominated the Aegean for centuries, received a blow from which it never fully recovered. Within a century of the eruption, the great Minoan palace centers at Knossos and elsewhere had declined or been destroyed. Now, consider what the Thera eruption looked like from a distance. An island in the sea. A catastrophic explosion. The island's center collapsing into the ocean, generating massive waves. The island effectively disappearing, its central portion swallowed by the sea, and consider what the Minoan civilization was. Based on the island of Crete, with settlements and trading posts across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. A maritime power. Builders of great palaces. A sophisticated culture with art, plumbing, and architectural achievements that were astonishing for their time. A civilization that, within a relatively short period, collapsed. The Minoan connection to Atlantis was first proposed seriously by the Greek archaeologist Angelos Gallinopoulos in the 1960s, and it has been developed and refined by numerous scholars since. The argument is this: the Atlantis story is a distorted, geographically displaced, and temporally inflated account of the Thera eruption and the fall of Minoan civilization. The distortions can be explained. Geographic displacement. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, i.e., in the Atlantic. But if the story came to Solon through Egyptian sources, and those Egyptian sources were working from garbled or translated accounts, the beyond the pillars locator might be a misunderstanding. The Pillars of Hercules, in some ancient usages, referred not to the Strait of Gibraltar but to other navigational landmarks in the Aegean. Temporal inflation, the factor of 10 error mentioned earlier. If 9,000 years is actually 900 years, the date of Atlantis's destruction aligns with the Thera eruption. The scale, Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a continent-sized landmass. The Minoan civilization did not occupy a continent. But at its peak, Minoan influence spread across the Aegean, the eastern Mediterranean, and parts of the Near East. If Egyptian scribes were describing not a single island but a thalassocracy, a maritime empire spread across many islands and coastlines, it might have seemed as large as a continent. And then there is the archaeology. Buried beneath several meters of volcanic ash on the island of Thera, archaeologists have excavated the ruins of a Minoan town called Akrotiri. It was preserved by the eruption in the same way Pompeii was later preserved by Vesuvius, frozen in time, its streets and buildings and frescoes intact. What they found at Akrotiri is extraordinary. Multi-story buildings. Sophisticated drainage systems. Toilets connected to drains. Walls covered in brilliant, detailed frescoes depicting landscapes, animals, ships, and people. Evidence of a prosperous, aesthetically sophisticated urban culture. A culture that, by all evidence, was thriving, and then. In a matter of hours or days, was buried alive. The people of Akrotiri apparently had some warning. The site shows evidence of an earlier, smaller earthquake that preceded the main eruption by some time. The residents seem to have evacuated. Unlike Pompeii, Akrotiri contains relatively few human remains. The people left. They took their valuables. They fled, and then the mountain exploded, and they never came back. The Minoan Thera theory is compelling, but it is not the only serious candidate. And for every piece of evidence that supports it, there are scholars who point to problems, inconsistencies that prevent it from being a clean solution, the Strait of Gibraltar problem. The most persistent objection to the Minoan theory is Plato's specific placement of Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Strait of Gibraltar is unambiguous in ancient Greek geography. It was the boundary between the known Mediterranean world and the vast, mysterious Atlantic beyond. Why would Plato place his island clearly and explicitly in the Atlantic if he was actually describing something in the Aegean? This has led some researchers to take the Atlantic location seriously, not as a sunken continent, but as a reference to real Atlantic landmasses that existed or were reduced in earlier periods. The Azores Plateau, for instance, sits at the intersection of three tectonic plates in the mid-Atlantic. The islands visible today are the peaks of a much larger underwater formation. Geological surveys have confirmed that parts of this plateau were above sea level during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower. Could there have been a real, inhabited landmass in the Atlantic that was significantly reduced by rising post-glacial seas? The geological evidence does not support a rapid, catastrophic sinking. The process was gradual, over thousands of years, not a single day and night as Plato describes. But if the story is already distorted in transmission, perhaps the dramatic, single day and night, is mythological compression of a much longer process, the Black Sea flood theory. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed a theory that, while not specifically about Atlantis, offers a candidate catastrophe of enormous proportions. Their research suggested that around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea, then a large, freshwater lake sitting below sea level, was breached by rising Mediterranean waters pouring through what is now the Bosphorus Strait. The resulting flood was enormous. Water poured into the Black Sea basin at an estimated rate 200 times that of Niagara Falls, raising the water level by as much as a meter per day and ultimately flooding an area of approximately 150,000 square kilometers of previously inhabited coastline. Coastal communities around the Black Sea would have been inundated rapidly and catastrophically. This event, if it happened as Ryan and Pittman described, would have been experienced by the people living through it as the end of their world. A massive, rapidly rising flood destroying everything along an entire sea's coastline. Could a memory of this catastrophe have been transmitted, distorted over millennia, into stories of sunken civilizations? Could it be one source, among several, for the mythology of a great flood that appears in cultures across the ancient world, from the biblical flood to the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh to Hindu flood myths? The Black Sea flood hypothesis has been challenged on technical grounds by other geologists. The scale and speed of the event are disputed. But the possibility of a major Black Sea flooding event in the prehistoric period remains an active area of research. The Rikhat structure, in the Sahara Desert, in the country of Mauritania, there is a geological formation so large it is best seen from space. It is called the Rikhat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara or the Eye of Africa. From above, it appears as a series of concentric circles, roughly 50 kilometers in diameter, in the middle of the desert. For decades, geologists believed it was the result of a meteor impact. More recent geological analysis suggests it was formed by geological uplift, a dome of rock that formed and then eroded into its current circular shape. But in recent years, a small but vocal group of researchers have proposed something different. They argue that the Rikhat structure's concentric ring pattern closely matches Plato's description of the capital city of Atlantis, which Plato describes as being built on a hill surrounded by alternating rings of land and water. The dimensions, they argue, roughly correspond to Plato's stated measurements for the city. If the Sahara was once less arid than it is today, and it was, during the so-called African humid period that ended around 5000 BCE, when parts of the Sahara were grassland and savanna with rivers and lakes, then the Rikhat structure would have had access to water. Could a civilization have existed there? Most geologists and archaeologists find this theory far-fetched. The Rick-Hat structure is a natural geological formation, and there is no archaeological evidence of a significant ancient civilization at the site. The resemblance to Plato's description, while superficially intriguing, may be entirely coincidental. Human minds are very good at finding patterns that aren't there, but it illustrates the breadth of the search. People are looking in deserts, in oceans, in seas, in lakes, on islands. The question refuses to die, the philosophical fiction theory, and then there is the position held by the majority of classical scholars: Plato made it up. Not carelessly, not randomly, but deliberately, with purpose. Plato was a master of what might be called philosophical myth-making, constructing elaborate, vivid narratives to illustrate philosophical points. The story of Aer, a soldier who dies, travels to the afterlife, and returns to describe the cosmic order, is clearly invented, and everyone in antiquity understood it as such. The allegory of the cave is an invented scenario designed to illustrate the nature of knowledge and illusion. Atlantis, this view holds, is the same kind of thing. A cautionary tale about the corruption of a great civilization by wealth, power, and imperial ambition. Plato sets it in a deep, mythological past to give it the weight of historical example. He makes it specific and detailed to give it credibility. He attributes it to Egyptian priests, conveniently uncheckable, to give it an air of exotic authority. The Atlanteans are described in Critias as having begun as noble, virtuous people, descendants of the god Poseidon, who gradually became corrupted by wealth and power, losing their divine nature as they accumulated material success. Their destruction is divine punishment for moral failure. That is a philosophical and religious narrative structure, not a historical one, and the convenient role of Athens as the heroic power that defeated Atlantis's imperial aggression smells strongly of Athenian propaganda, precisely the kind of national self-glorification that ancient writers routinely produced. This explanation is clean, coherent, and supported by everything we know about how Plato worked. But it doesn't explain why Plato's geographical and chronological details happen to align, in striking ways, with real events and real places. And it doesn't explain why, if the story was clearly fiction, ancient writers who were far closer to Plato in time disagreed fiercely about whether it was real. Because they did. In antiquity, the debate about Atlantis was already raging. Plato's own student Aristotle apparently believed the story was invented. But other ancient writers, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Proclus, took it seriously as history. The debate is not a modern invention. It began within Plato's own lifetime. Whatever Plato intended, there is a separate, parallel story happening in the archaeological and geological record, one that doesn't depend on Plato at all. The ancient Mediterranean world experienced multiple, dramatic catastrophes in the second millennium BCE. The Bronze Age collapse, the near-simultaneous fall of virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, is one of the most debated and mysterious events in ancient history. Within the space of roughly 50 years, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians' New Kingdom, the Ugaritic civilization, the Cypriot city-states, and multiple other cultures all declined catastrophically or disappeared entirely. Cities were burned and abandoned. Palace economies collapsed. Trade networks fell apart. Writing systems were lost. Population levels plummeted. It was, by any measure, one of the worst disasters in ancient human history. We still don't know what caused it. Theories include climate change and drought, the Sea People's invasions recorded in Egyptian texts, internal rebellions, earthquakes, systems collapse, or some combination of all of these. The Bronze Age collapse is a real, documented, catastrophic civilizational disappearance. And it happened in exactly the region where Plato set his story. Before the Bronze Age collapse, there was the Thera eruption. Before Thera, there were the rising seas of the post-glacial period. The ancient world was genuinely, repeatedly, catastrophically disrupted by events that would have seemed, to the people experiencing them, like the end of everything. Is it so strange that memory of these events, distorted, conflated, mythologized, and transmitted through centuries of oral tradition before being written down, might contain some kernel of real historical experience. There is now an entire scientific discipline devoted to this question, geomythology. The study of how real geological and environmental events become embedded in mythology and oral tradition. And its findings are remarkable. The myths of the Lusi people of Papua New Guinea contain accurate descriptions of volcanic eruptions that geologists can match to specific historical events. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions contain accurate geographic information about the flooding of specific coastal features that occurred more than 10,000 years ago, matching the post-glacial sea level rises that reshaped Australian coastlines. The Greek myth of Phaeton, the son of the sun god who drove his father's chariot too close to the earth, burning the world before being struck down, has been interpreted as a possible cultural memory of a meteor impact. Human oral tradition, it turns out, can preserve accurate information across extraordinary spans of time, if the event was catastrophic enough to demand preservation, and what event could be more catastrophic, more worth preserving in the deepest layers of cultural memory, than an island civilization, a powerful maritime world, disappearing beneath the sea. So here is where we stand. We have a specific, detailed account from one of the most serious thinkers in Western history, a man who explicitly claims his story is historical fact. We have real geological events, the Thera eruption, the post-glacial sea level rise, the Black Sea flood, the Bronze Age collapse, that could plausibly be the real events behind the story. We have archaeological evidence, at Akrotiri, at Minoan Crete, at Bronze Age sites across the Aegean, of sophisticated civilizations that were real, that flourished, and that were dramatically disrupted. We have geomythology suggesting that human oral tradition can preserve accurate memories of geological catastrophes across millennia, and we have an absence, no definitive sunken city in the Atlantic, no archaeological site that clearly corresponds to Plato's description, no ancient Egyptian records that confirm the account Plato attributes to Egyptian priests. Does Atlantis exist? That depends entirely on what you mean by the question, is there a sunken supercivilization beneath the Atlantic Ocean? With crystal towers and advanced technology beyond anything we understand? Almost certainly not. The ocean floor of the Atlantic has been mapped. There is no evidence of it, but is there a real historical memory, distorted, displaced, inflated, and mythologized, buried somewhere in Plato's account? That is a much harder question to answer. And the honest answer is, we don't know whether Plato invented the story or transmitted it. We don't know what Egyptian records might have said. We don't know how far back the chain of transmission goes. We don't know whether the Minoans, with their maritime empire and their island catastrophe, became, in the warped mirror of ancient memory. The Atlanteans, we don't know whether there are people alive today who carry in their genetic and cultural inheritance the legacy of a civilization whose name we have forgotten and whose story we can only guess at. The ocean keeps its secrets. The past keeps its secrets. And Plato, brilliant, precise, and maddeningly ambiguous, keeps his. There is a thing that happens when you stand on the rim of the caldera at Santorini and look down into the dark water below. You are standing on the edge of a catastrophe. Beneath the water in front of you is the collapsed center of a volcano that, 3,500 years ago, tore itself apart in one of the largest explosions in human history. The water is deep and dark and absolutely still. The walls of the caldera drop straight down on all sides, hundreds of meters to the sea floor. Somewhere beneath that water, beneath the boats and the tourists and the beautiful white villages perched on the rim, there is a city. A real city. Akrotiri. Buried under meters of ash, preserved in the dark, waiting, most of it has never been excavated. The part that has been uncovered has yielded walls and rooms and staircases and frescoes of extraordinary beauty. The rest is still there. Still waiting, and perhaps somewhere in those unexcavated rooms, under all that ash and all those centuries, there is something that would change everything. A text. A record. A name. Something that would tell us, finally, who these people were and what they remembered and whether the stories they told about the world, about islands that sank, about golden ages lost, about civilizations swallowed by the sea, were stories they had heard from their ancestors, echoing backward through time to an even older catastrophe that no one has yet identified, or perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps Plato was a philosopher who understood something true about the world, that great civilizations rise and fall, that power corrupts, that nothing lasts, that the sea is patient and the land is not permanent. Perhaps Atlantis is not a place to be found. Perhaps it is a warning to be heard, the water is very still. The caldera is very deep, and somewhere beneath the surface of things, the past is always waiting. Text on screen. The Thera eruption is scientifically dated to approximately 1620 to 1530 BCE. Akrotiri, buried under volcanic ash, was rediscovered in 1967. Over 95% of the Akrotiri site remains unexcavated. No definitive physical evidence of Atlantis has ever been found.